Tov. Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. Today we have, we're learning for two purposes. One, of course, is always the Ilu Nishmat Avigdor Chai Avram and Meir Tzivah Rachalea, Shamash Eben Aliyah. Today also marks, as I mentioned in the group, marks the Shloshim of Ari, could the full name, please? Ari Yechiel Ben, Avram Ruvain, and Miriam Zenilman, yes, Shem Yikom Damo. Today we have a special guest speaker, and I want to also thank Eric Luke for bringing Rabbi Brull to my attention, asking about speaking this morning. I'm going to read the bio, and then I'll turn the floor over. Rabbi Brull is originally from London, and he studied, you'll have to get used to the accent, it's okay. You got my Chicago accent, his London accent. And he studied Yeshivat Har Etzion for over a decade, during which he served in the IDF through the Hesder program. After returning to Yeshiva, Rabbi Brull joined the Kol HaHalacha and received smicha from Chief Rabbi of Israel, as well as from Rabbi Zalman Nechemia Goldberg Zatzal and Rabbi Moshe Lichtenstein Shlita Zatzal. No, Shlita, Slicha, Moshe, Slicha. I'll tell you about a story about that another time. Yeah, I did something, but someone did something that was horrible. He subsequently studied in Yeshiva's Kol HaGvoha for advanced Talmudic study. Excuse me. Rabbi Brull received a Bachelor of Education with high distinction in Hebrew language and Torah Sheval Peh from Herzog College, and studied for an MA in Jewish education at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He arrived in Melbourne with his family in 2021 and serves as the Mizrahi's Rosh Kol Torah Mitzion, whereby he gives numerous shiurim throughout the community each day as an active member of the rabbinic team. Please welcome Rabbi Brull. Thank you very much. Let me just get this on the screen and you'll be good to go. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Chandela, for giving the opportunity to speak, and thank you to Mishpachat Lifshitz for hosting. It's particularly special to be here in Mitzvah of obviously the circumstances bringing us here are tough, but yeah, I'm grateful to be able to give a shir in Ari's, my wife Shira's hometown. Today we're going to be discussing a topic obviously very topical, mamash now as we speak in these couple of days, and obviously throughout the period we're in now, is to look at the perspective or the religious or Jewish perspective on the question of Pidyon Shvuim throughout the generations. From the days of Avraham Avinu, Parshat Lech Lecha, Vayishma Avraham, Ki Nishba Achiv, Vayarket Chanichav, that Avraham Avinu rushed forward to hear when he heard that his nephew Lot had been taken into captivity, how he rushed to redeem him, to release him. And throughout the ages, the question of what exactly are the parameters, or what is the place of Pidyon Shvuim and the price at which one must pay in order to release those in captivity has been discussed throughout Jewish history. And that's what we're going to look at today, from the Gemarot through the Rishonim until contemporary sources. So the Gemara in Bava Batra tells us that the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim, of redeeming those in captivity, the Gemara defines it in Bava Batra Daf Chet as a mitzvah rabbah, as a great mitzvah. Not too many mitzvot we say it's a mitzvah rabbah. We like to say things are great, but to call it a mitzvah rabbah is quite the title. And the Gemara there elaborates on this, and the Rambam, if we look in source 1, discusses this concept further. And the Rambam there in source 1, Hilchot Matnot Aniyim, interesting place, by the way, for the discussion on Pidyon Shvuim. The halachot of Matnot Aniyim is to do with gifts to the poor people who are unwell, and basically the mitzvot of charity. And that is where the Rambam places the concept of Pidyon Shvuim, redeeming those who are in captivity, which is something to think about. The Rambam there says in source 1, En lecha mitzvah gedola Pidyon Shvuim. There's no greater mitzvah than redeeming those who are in captivity. Sheshavoi harhu bichlal haraevim v'atzmeim harumim. Because those in captivity are essentially the biggest charity case that one can have. They're not only poor, they're not only starving, they are everything. They are re'evim, they're tzmeim, arumim, they're not clothed, they're not taken care of, and unfortunately this resonates very much with us nowadays. And therefore it's the greatest mitzvah, which is why the Rambam again places this mitzvah in terms of his placement of halachic categorization in Hilchot Matnot Aniyim, in the laws of charity. And the Rambam goes on there, and he's quite strong about this, and he says, somebody who turns their eyes away from endeavoring or using all their effort to redeem someone in captivity, Ari Zenilman, they transgress, and then he gives a whole list of averot. Somebody who doesn't invest in pidyon shvuyim transgresses. Lo ta'amet levavecha, lo tikpot al yadcha, lo ta'amod al dam reyecha, lo yirden b'farech le'einecha. He gives a list of transgressions which one who doesn't invest enough in pidyon shvuyim essentially transgresses. Ubitel mitzvot, and then he gives a list of positive mitzvot which one has forgone. Patoch tiftach et yadcha lo, v'chei achicha imach, v'havta l'reyecha kamocha. In other words, the idea of mitzvot shvuyim really incorporates all of the various facets of what we might call social halacha. And he gives a whole list. The harbed varim ka'elu, he says the list is not exhaustive. Harbed varim ka'elu. Many mitzvot are involved in the notion of pidyon shvuyim. Ve'en lecha mitzvah rabak pidyon shvuyim. There's no greater mitzvah than redeeming those who are in captivity. And having said that, it seems obviously okay. The Gemara there calls it mitzvah rabbah. The Rambam is okay, convinced us. We know this is a supreme value, the idea of every life, and that, as we say in Israel, no one is left behind, and to ensure that we bring everyone home. So if it's really a mitzvah rabbah, it's such a great mitzvah and so important, that seems to be at odds with the following source, the Mishnah and Gemara in Masechet Gittin, which discusses the certain limitations which Chazal imposed. They said that true, it's mitzvah rabbah, as we saw Baba Batra and the Rambam, but that doesn't mean that you can redeem shvuyim at any cost. And this is the Mishnah discusses in source 2 in Masechet Gittin. Says the Mishnah there, Ein podinet hashvuyim yeta al kadei mehem. There's a requirement that one is not allowed to redeem those in captivity yeta al kadei mehem, more than their monetary value, more than their worth. In other words, 1,000 for one. Bonagid, in theory, everything we're saying is theoretical. Of course, we're discussing a sugya, not telling anyone what to do. Disclaimer. So, ein podim shvuyim yeta al kadei mehem. One may not redeem for somebody who's in captivity for more than their value, more than their worth. What's the reason? Mipnei tikun ha'olam, in order to better the world. In other words, the Gemara discusses exactly what this means. We'll see in a moment. It would be unseemly. It wouldn't lead to good things if every time one person was captive, we gave, many people in return. The Mishnah continues there and discusses that you're also not supposed to help them escape under certain circumstances, but we'll skip in source 2 to the second paragraph. The Gemara there says, what is this limitation that Chazal imposed? Halfway through source 2, Gemara, the Gemara asks, what does it mean? What does it mean that we're not allowed to redeem captives more than their worth because of tikkun ha'olam? The Gemara gives two options. Mishum duchta de tziburahu. Is it because of duchta de tzibura, because of too much pressure on the tzibur, on the community? Just in time. O dilma, or perhaps mishum de lo ligru v'lai tutfei, because we're worried that we don't want to incentivize them to then come and seize and capture more people. In other words, what is the reason that Chazal imposed a limitation about how much we can do? Is it because it's too much for the community? If the community have to pay huge sums of money to redeem, that's considered too far. It's for duchta de tzibura, not to have too much financial pressure, which could break the community. Or is the concern not because of the community, it's going to be too much of financial pressure on the community, but because the word ligrov, so you say ligrov garbaim, socks, but ligrov is really to grab, right? Ligrov, to grab. The concern is that if we, every time that they release somebody, we pay huge amounts of money to get them back, or a deal which seems unbalanced, then there's a concern it's going to incentivize the enemy to do it again, because this is it's good for business. So what is the rationale? So the Gemara tries to understand what the reason is that Chazal imposed limitations on what one can do to redeem captives. So Tashama, the Gemara brings the following story: the Levi bar darga parka lebarte betlesa alfei dinari zahav. That certain gentleman, Levi bar darga, redeemed his daughter who was taken into captivity for 13,000 golden dinars. Okay, that was more than her, I guess, worth. So the Gemara says, what do you see from there? You see from there the fact that he paid so much means that the reason that one is not allowed to redeem for more than one's worth is because it's duchta de tzibura. It poses too much of a financial strain on the community. But if an individual happens to be wealthy and they want to pay all the money in the world, that's allowed. So you see the rationale was not because it will incentivize the enemy, but rather it's because of communal funds. But if an individual wants to redeem like Levi bar darga, that would be allowed. The Gemara rejects this proof. Amar Abai says, that's not true. Uman leima landim rason chachamim avad. Now, this is fascinating to see this in the Gemara. Abaye's retort is, who said that when Lady Badarga did this, it was B'Ritzon Chachamim? Who said he asked his rabbi? Who said he asked the Chachamim? Maybe he just did it. Dilma Shelo B'Ritzon Chachamim Avad. Maybe he just went out and he did it. You don't often see that in the Gemara. When the Gemara will bring a proof from somebody, the Gemara will then retort, no, that's not a proof. Maybe he wasn't acting in accordance with halacha. It's an interesting, it's quite unique in that regard. But again, I think coming to what we're feeling today, sort of the emotional pressure the Gemara is understanding, and Abaye here in this is understanding that when it comes to the distress of having a family member who's in captivity, that's just people act first and ask questions later. You do what you've got to do to bring home your loved ones, and that's something which we will see later on in the shiur. In other words, the Gemara rejects this proof and says, no, maybe really it's not allowed. Even an individual is not allowed to pay because it will incentivize the enemy further. But Lady Badarga just acted, he didn't consult with the Chachamim, and he did what he had to do to bring his daughter home. So this is the discussion. But we do see here from this sugya, Masechah Gittin, that there is a certain limitation on what one may do in order to redeem those in captivity. In terms of psak halacha, so how does the Rambam paskin? What is the real rationale as to why Chazal put a limitation on what one can do for redeeming those in captivity? So the Rambam there enforces 3 rules. Again in Hilchot Matnot Aniyim, Ein podim et hashvoyim beyeter al dmehem mipnei tikkun ha'olam. What is not allowed to redeem captives for more than their financial worth because of tikkun ha'olam. What is the tikkun ha'olam? Says the Rambam, shelo yehu ha'oivim rodfim acharehem lishbotam. So that the enemy will not then pursue them to capture them, won't incentivize the enemy. In other words, the Rambam rules like rationale number 2 offered by the Gemara. So that is how the Rambam paskins, and it's similarly reflected in the Shulchan Aruch, which I didn't bring on the sheet in Yerodei Reish Pei Bet. Okay, so that seems to be again at odds with what we saw in source 1. Here, the Sugya in Masechah Gittin adds limitations as to what one may do for Pidyon Shvuyim, which seems to be at odds with the fact that the Gemara in Bava Batra and the Rambam had called it a mitzvah rabbah. So how do we reconcile the two sugyot, the two discussions of what exactly is how do they go together? What is the bottom line, a halachic view on the notion of Pidyon Shvuyim? Before we get there, let's complicate matters further by looking at another Gemara in Masechet Gittin, which brings a story there in the 5th parak of Gittin, in the discussion of the Agadot HaChurban, all the stories there post-destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, of the Romans came here and all the terrible things that they did. So the following story in source 4 appears. In source 4, the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, Ma'aseh Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania. There was an incident with Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania. Shalach Lakarach Gadol Sheba Romi. He went to this big city in the Roman Empire, which is after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Amrulo, and they said to him, they said to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, Tinok Echad, and this is Korei Alev. But you think about it, especially with thinking about, Kfir Bibas, who's one and still in captivity, and you listen to the description, and I when I first learned this sugya again in recent times, I could just have very much his picture etched in my mind as I read this description. Amrullah, they said to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, Tinok Echad Yesh Bebeit Asurim, there's a young child who's in prison here in Rome, who's been taken when they came, they destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, and they took over Eretz Yisrael. The Romans also took people back as Avadim, and there's a young child in captivity. Beautiful eyes, beautiful curls, and he's here in prison. So what did Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania do? Halach va'amad al petach beit ha'asurim. He went and he stood at the entrance of the prison house. Amar, and he recited the pasuk in Yeshayahu, or half the pasuk, or some of the pasuk Yeshayahu. Mi natan lim shisa Yaakov. Who allowed Yaakov to be trampled so? But Yisrael levozizim, and Israel to be plundered as such. How could this happen? And that's half of the pasuk. Ana ototinok. He heard the young child respond the second half of the pasuk. This was not just a child, a learned child who knew Nach, he knew Navi, and he knew how to respond the second half of the pasuk. Ana ototinok va'amar. The tinok responded to him. Halo Hashem zu chatanu lo. It's God who we've sinned to has done this to us. V'lo avu b'drachav haloch v'lo shamu b'torato, because we did not follow in Hashem's ways. So this wasn't just a child in captivity, but this was a very gifted child in captivity. So Amar, so Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania hears that he knows this child who's in captivity knows Nach, and he says, Israel. I'm sure this child is going to grow up to be a great leader of Israel. He knows he's very gifted. Ha'avodah, by God, I promise. She'eni zaz mikan ad she'efdanu b'chol mamon sheposkim alav. I will pay whatever price to get this child out. I'll pay whatever it is to get this child out and bring him home. Amru, and Chazal say, Lo zaz misham ad she'pata'o b'mamon harbeh. So Chazal tell that Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanan did not move from Rome, from that spot, until he redeemed him for all the money, mamon harbeh, all the money that he could. V'lo hayu yamim mu'atim, and it wasn't long, ad she'hora Ab Yisrael, this child who he redeemed, grew up to be a great leader in Israel. Umanu, who is it? One of the Tanaim, Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. The Tana, Rabbi Yishmael, question of whether it's the Rabbi Yishmael or another Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, but he is the Tana, a Tana of the Mishnah. This is who this child grew up to be. So, heartbreaking story, but for our intents and purposes, okay, well, how did that work? He was able to redeem him with mamon harbeh, with a huge amount of money. That seems again to be at odds with what we saw earlier in Masechet Gittin in source 2, which said that one's only allowed to redeem kedei mehen according to one's work, but one cannot bring too much, cannot redeem somebody for too much. So how do we reconcile all of these sources? So again, we've got one source which says that Pidyon Shloim is a mitzvah rabbah. It's a great mitzvah. We have the Mishnah and Gemara in Masechet Gittin in the 4th parak, which tell us that no, Chazal put certain restrictions so as not to incentivize the enemy, that you cannot just pay extortionate amounts to redeem someone in captivity. It's not at any price. And then we have this story about this child who Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya did pay mamon harbeh, a huge amount of money, in order to redeem. So how do we reconcile all of this?
Individual paying and communal paying.
So you have to you'll do rewind on the recording. It's all good. So how did this play out? So really, there's two different Tosfot, we're going to look at, which essentially provide 4 answers as to what are the rules or the limitations regarding the question of Pidyon Shvuim. How do we reconcile all of these sources? So let's have a look at the first Tosfot in source 5. Kol mamon sheposkim alav. So any money that one pays. So why is it that Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya was allowed to redeem this child for a huge amount of money, and he wasn't limited by the Mishnah we saw earlier? So Tosfot explain, they give here 2 answers in source 5. They call mamon sheposkim alav, say Tosfot, ki ika sakanat nefashot hodin shvuyin yeta al kedei dmeihem. So the first answer is that if there's sakanat nefashot, that it's not just that they're holding them for ransom, but they are really at sakanat nefashot, their life is in danger, then that Mishnah doesn't apply. Says Tosfot, first answer, that Mishnah was only talking about when someone was being held for ransom, they were being held in a room somewhere. But when it's pikuach nefesh mamash, their life is in danger, you're dealing with an evil enemy who's going to kill them, who's going to really harm them, not treating them well, they're not just holding them for ransom, then one pays yoter al kedei mehen. There's no limit. Whatever it is to save a life. We know that we do everything, almost everything, for pikuach nefesh, which is docheh kol hatarakula. That's the first answer, and they bring a proof from elsewhere.
Does that mean only like in money, or does it mean going to all lengths, like whether it be like trading prisoners?
Prisoner exchange, so-called exchange. Yeah. It's an interesting question. Perhaps we'll look at that in a little bit later on in the shiur. Right now, we're dealing with what might seem to be a fair or equal sort of, if you take the emotion out of it, just eye for an eye, person for a person type deal. That's what would seem to be emanating from this sugya. But the first answer is that limitation was only talking about somebody who's being held for ransom, but they're being treated okay. But somewhere in the sakanat nefashot, you do everything. That's the first answer of Tosfot. I give another answer there at the end, which is a bit difficult for the ears sometimes. If you look at the final line there in source 5, inami alternatively, mishum de muflag b'chochma haya. In other words, because he was going to be a chacham. So protectia for the rabbanim, but it doesn't really mean protectia, but it means that somebody who's muflach b'chochma, someone's going to grow up to be a talmid chacham. We're not just a talmid chacham, someone's going to be a communal leader. We have to invest in them. If they go and we'll see a story about this in the Middle Ages in a moment, but if they go after the best of the nation, then what will be left of Am Yisrael? If they go after all the future rabbis and then they're not left, we have to redeem them in order for Am Yisrael to continue. So that's the second answer which Tosfot provides. The first answer is pikuach nefesh is different. The second answer is because somebody who is muflag b'chochma, somebody who's particularly bright and has a future where it's going to be a leader of Israel, then that sanction didn't apply. That limitation didn't apply. Sorry. So, okay. It's a difficult one for the ears. What's even more difficult is the first answer, which seems to be the most compelling, is not brought by the Shulchan Aruch there in Yerodei Reish Pei Bet. Only the second answer is brought. The question that somebody who's going to be a Muflei Chochmah, in the words of the Shulchan Aruch, he talks about a Talmid Chacham or even a Talmid Charif, a Talmid who's not right now a Talmid Chacham, but they're a sharp, a very astute student, and you see that they've got a bright future ahead of them to be a leader of Israel. Then one would be allowed to invest more funds in them. Those are two answers provided by Tosfot. We're going to see that by the time we get to contemporary discussions, the story is going to be very different, which will also be related to the point you raised as well. The second Tosfot in source 6 provides two more answers. The low ligrubu v'laitu, that we saw that the Gemara had said that there's concerns. We don't want them to ligrubu. They won't grab. They won't come and seize more people. We don't want to incentivize the enemy. The Gemara again says there's another source, which is Tosfot says there's another Gemara which is at odds with this in source 6. The low ligrubu v'laitu. Tosfot asks, "V'ha detanya b'perek na'ara." We learn in Masechet Ketubot. Nishbet v'hayu mevakshim mimenu ad asara b'dameha. Pan rishon podeh. So the writer in Masechet Ketubot says that if somebody's wife is captured, then one has to pay even up to 10 times the amount of her value to redeem her. One is obligated to. So how does that work without sugya? So the Tosfot say, Shani ishto, one's wife is different. The havya kugufo yotem bito dehacha, because it's like one's gufo. Ishto kugufo, bal isha are a unit, and one's spouse is like part of them. And therefore, one would do everything for one's spouse, the same way that one would for themselves, which is different to the case in the Gemara here, where Levi Bar Darga wanted to redeem his daughter, because a daughter is one step removed, but one's spouse is you're one unit, and therefore va'alatzmo, it's like part of yourself, va'alatzmo, and regarding oneself, lo tiknu shelo yiten kol asher lo ba'ad nafsho. Chazal never impose sanctions that one cannot do for themselves, whatever one has to do in order to redeem oneself. So Tosfot say that a spouse is part of oneself. And sure, there's a general rule or a limitation which is imposed on the tzibur, on the community. But when it comes to an individual, no, you do what you want, meaning somebody right now who's in captivity, they do whatever they need to do to get out themselves. And therefore, by extension, that would apply to one's spouse. So that's another answer, which is that one spouse would be different, and one would do absolutely everything for one spouse. And there's discussions in the Torah in Even Ezer in this regard as well. Another answer which they give, if we just skip to the top of the second page, is that he quotes the story of Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, who redeemed that small child for a huge amount of money, and he gives two answers again. Bani Zakin, the fish haya muflag b'chokhma. We already saw that answer. Somebody who's a chacham or has a bright future. Inami, and this is an important point. Another answer, which is now a fourth answer. B'shat churban habayit lo shayach lo ligrabu. That story was in the Agadat of the Churban, as I mentioned. That was in the list of all the things which happened in the aftermath of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. When you're talking about the stories of the Churban Habayit, destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the concern that we're going to incentivize the enemy is lo shayach. It doesn't apply. Why would it not apply? Because right now, post Churban Beit HaMikdash, what were Am Yisrael concerned with at the time? They weren't concerned necessarily with what's the future going to be. Right now, they've got to save each and every life. The Romans had come, they destroyed the people, they murdered so many, they destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, they murdered so many people. Right now, the immediate concern is to protect as many people as we can. So if we have somebody right now in captivity that we can redeem, we've got to do everything. Or in the words of Tosfot, B'shat Churban Habayit, lo shayach lo. This whole concern doesn't apply. In a state of Churban, what you've got to do is you've got to get as many people as you can right now. You don't worry about the long term. You've got to worry about the short term in the here and now. So these are different answers which are presented by the Baalei Tosfot as to how to reconcile and grapple with these conflicting sugyot. So four answers essentially is to see how we reconcile that Tosfot have presented. The first answer is that when it's pekuach nefesh mamash, when it's not somebody who's being held in a room for ransom, but their life is in danger, then none of these restrictions apply. We do everything immediately. Interestingly enough, and it's quite concerning, the Shulchan Aruch does not bring that answer as a halachic conclusion, although some of the Nosei Kelim do discuss it, and it sort of comes back in the modern times a bit, as we will see. Second answer is that a Talmid Chacham, or somebody who's going to be a Talmid Chacham, would be different. The rationale presumably being because we're worried about the future of Am Yisrael. We're thinking about the end game here, not just in the interim. The third answer is that when it comes to one's spouse, certainly there's no restrictions, the same way that for oneself, on the individual, one does everything that they can to get themselves out. And it's only, we're talking here in terms of a klal, in terms of setting out protocol for the nation as to what we do on a memshalti level. And the fourth answer is, as we saw at the top here of page 2, that Pshat HaChurban, it's different. When talking about Churban Beit HaMikdash and Am Yisrael are being destroyed, then you grab whoever you can and you don't worry about the long-term incentivization. You've got to get who you can right now. So that's the discussion in the Balei Tosfot there in the 11th and 12th centuries. If we go we sort of skip a century later, there's a story of the Maharam Mirottenberg. Rabbeinu Meir Mirottenberg was the Gadol Hadar, was the leading Rishon in Ashkenaz in the 13th century. And the Maharam Mirottenberg was actually taken into captivity and was imprisoned. And he was, just to understand who he was actually the father of Ashkenaz. Amongst his Talmidim were many of the leading Rishonei or late Rishonei Ashkenaz. You had the Rosh, who fled to Spain, and then two other Talmidim of the Maharam Mirottenberg was also the Haggart Maimoniot, famous commentary on the Rambam, and also the Mordechai, who also comments on the Gemara. So the Maharam Mirottenberg was a leading, the Gadol Hadar of Ashkenaz in the 13th century, and he was imprisoned, and by the delightful locals, and they sorry, it's British sarcasm still, it comes back, and they get used to it. So it's an Aussie here, he'll understand. So it's all good, and I understand it's they're well versed. So, and the people said, hang on, we just saw that sugya which says that someone who's a Talmid Chacham, you can redeem. And the non-Jews who put him in prison wanted a huge amount of money from the Jewish community in order to redeem the rabbi, not just the rabbi of the community, but the rabbi of essentially Yahadut Ashkenaz. And the Maharam said, I will not let you redeem me. He said, what are you talking about? Don't you know the Tosfot? Expected the Maharam. Don't you know the Tosfot, which says that Muflog B'Chachma is different, somebody who's particularly great is different? He would not allow them to redeem him, and he actually died in prison. He wasn't killed, he died of old age in prison. He wrote Sfarim there, and he died in prison. And only after his death, somebody paid a huge amount of money to actually redeem his body and bring him to bury. So 3 centuries after this, the Maharshal, the Yam Shel Shlomo, discusses how could the Maharam do this? There's a time for humility, but this is not it. Don't say, oh, I'm not so great. How could he not allow the community to redeem him? Did he understand the repercussions of him being stuck in prison? He was the leading posek of Ashkenazic Jewry, and he didn't allow himself to be redeemed. Why not? So the Yam Shel Shlomo, the Maharshal, discusses this in source 7, and he says, Shamati al Maharam Mirottenberg, Zichrono Livracha. I heard about the Maharam. Sher tafus b'migdol Eizham. So he was held in this tower, Kama Shanim, for several years. V'asar tava min hakilot sach gadol, and the prison guard demanded a huge amount of money from the Jewish community to redeem him. V'kilot hayu rotzim liftoto, and the Jewish community of Ashkenaz wanted to redeem the Maharam. V'lo hiniach, but he didn't allow them to pay the money. Ki amar, because he said to them, as the Mishnah that we learned, Ein podim etishlem yoter b'chdei mehem. The one is not allowed to redeem for more than one's worth. But Tameani, I'm astonished, says the Maharshal. Ma'achar she'er Talmid Chacham uflag. He wasn't just anyone. He was the Maharam Mirottenberg. He was a great Talmid Chacham, the leader of Ashkenazic Jewry. So how could it be? And he goes back and forth, but he concludes, what was the Maharam's rationale for not allowing the Jewish community to employ this heter to redeem him as a communal leader? His concern was, says the Maharshal, she'im yifdu oto, that if they do redeem him, if so, yesh lemechash, there'll be serious concerns. Shelo ya'asu kein kol hasarim letalmid chacham hamuflag shebadar. They might see it's sort of the idea of this heter to allow to redeem community leaders and rabbis and gedolei hadar. People will think, hang on, this is a great business. Let's go after all the rabbis because there's a heter there. They'll pay all the money. Okay, for any Shlomi here or there, they won't. But for the community rabbis, that's where the money is. So the Maharam was concerned, explains the Maharshal, that this will incentivize the enemy or the people at the time, those persecuting Am Yisrael, to dafka go after the community leaders, and in order that they will impose huge fines. And what will happen then? There'll be no Torah left if they take all of the rabbis of the entire Dar. So ba'avurov hamamon, for the huge amount of money, ad shelo yaspik mamon hagola liftotam. We might reach a case where then the Jewish community won't be able to actually redeem all of their leaders, which is takacha Torah Israel, and Torah will be forgotten from Israel. So there was a concern of the Maharam, explains the Maharshal, that it's basically this heter, if you like, which Tosfot presented, to where one can redeem somebody who has a bright future, is a community leader. Well, it just takes us one step away. It doesn't solve the problem, because then they'll say, okay, well, we'll just go after the Rabbanim, and we'll go after the Gedolei Hadar. And that is why, explains the Maharshal, the Maharam did not allow them to pay any money, because he saw ahead and saw, well, this is just going to, exacerbate the issue, essentially. And therefore, he died in prison. And that was quite astonishing. But we know, though, and this comes back to sort of bringing things, as we're going to come now into sort of more contemporary discussions, that there's a big difference between the Maharam Rottenberg and any sort of mitziyut of a hostage type situation that we're dealing with, Baklali in the modern times, but also obviously right now in the current milchama and the current crisis that we're going through. And that is that the Maharam Rottenberg wrote from jail. He sat in jail. He died in jail, but they didn't kill him. He just died in jail, natural causes. That is not the mitziyut. That is not the reality that we have today. And in many of the sort of contemporary sort of hostage situations that we've gone through in Medina Israel, that none of this seems to apply. There was before we get to that discussion, just another example of this heter not being used of the Maharam Rottenberg in 1970. So there was a plane, TWA plane, which was hijacked by a group of Palestinian terrorists. And on the plane was Rav Hutner. Rav Yitzchak Hutner was on the plane in September 1970. And there were discussions of his Talmidim in America whether we should pay money to try and get him out. We can't get them all out. They're having these sessions. They want to release prisoners, whatever it was. But let's pay to get him out. And they consulted Gedolei Hadar, and they said, no, you're not allowed to. Not because Rav Hutner wasn't great, but because, again, this whole sugya, already from the days of the Maharam Rottenberg, we no longer employ this special heter. There's no sort of automatic heter for Talmidei Chachamim or Gedolei Hadar. So not only in the 13th century, but even in the 20th century, this was something which was discussed. And in the end, Rav Hutner, they did all get out, but after a couple of weeks, and that was in 1970. Another hostage situation, which is obviously very famous, is Mivtza Yonatan in 1976, right, in Entebbe. And there, the Gedolei Hadar sat to discuss, and the Gedolim in Israel, I'm not sure if they thought they had any influence on the government, but they sat anyway to discuss what would be the halachic position on such a thing. And Rav Ovadia Yosef in source 8 discusses just exactly this. Then in his Yabia Omer, he discusses the Mivtza Yonatan and Entebbe, and the question about whether, and this is the first time we're talking now about not only payment for money, but they wanted shichrur mechablim. They wanted to release terrorists in return for to release the Israeli hostages. And there, Rav Ovadia discusses it, and he says the following, source 8. In our case as well, says Rav Ovadia, so here he comes to counter the claim that some made that, well, if one releases terrorists, then essentially that's going to cause more death in the future. And Rav Ovadia says that even so, that's not considered horeg bayadayim. If one were to release a terrorist in an exchange, that's not horeg bayadayim. That's not actively killing. One is releasing a terrorist. Harihu kamon. What does he compare it to? Shematet harimon yad likivun acher. If God forbid a rimon, a grenade is thrown in a chayal's direction or in somebody's direction, lo aleinu, and what does that person do before it explodes? They bat it away. Right? They get cricket bat, whatever. They just bat it away with their arm. Now, when they do that, there's a high chance that they've saved themselves. But what have they inadvertently done? They've caused it to kill somebody else. And it would essentially try to reduce the amount of death as much as possible. But what might one inadvertently do by batting away the grenade? You might inadvertently be killing somebody else. We don't say that. We say one's got to save their life in the here and now, as long as one doesn't deliberately do it at somebody else. But if it happens to maybe go to somebody else, one is not liable for such a thing. So says Rav Ovadia, it's the same thing here. that when one is releasing terrorists, according to Rabbi, and again, he's talking here again within the context of 1976, not saying it would necessarily apply here in the modern day, who knows, but what he had said then when discussing Mivtza Yonatan and the situation and the hostage situation in Entebbe is that it would be like releasing hostages by getting our hostages back by releasing terrorists would be okay, because it would be like batting away the grenade and not worrying about the consequences of where that grenade might land, because you've got to save in the here and now. So he says at the end of the second line there, Vadai adif la'asot ken milachot b'damam shel me'at haYehudim chatatei hamatos. So it's better to do that, to bat the grenade away, if it means that right now you're definitely going to save the lives of the hundreds of Jews on the hook and held hostage on the plane. V'havalei safek uvadai, the en safek motzi midei vadai. We've got safek b'kuach nefesh, that maybe by releasing these machablim, maybe in the future they will do something again. And now we've got vadai. Right now, the people on the planes' lives are in danger. They are threatening to kill people right now, every day that we don't release and give in to their demands. Safek and vadai, and therefore we have to go against the vadai, against the safek. It's quite a strong ta'ana, and certainly there are many who disagreed with Rabbi Ovadia Yosef on this psak. But again, I'm just bringing it just to show some of the literature in this regard, and that was another angle in which this was discussed. But again, for the first time, what we do see here is Rabbi Ovadia is utilizing the sugya, which seemed to speak about monetary compensation or monetary demands on the community, but now talking about shichrur machablim rather than actually asking for payment from the community. And he discusses that there. He speaks about a few other things. Just a nice little anecdote at the end there. If we go to in source 8, if we skip just the third paragraph, he discusses that, and he wrote the tshuva after the fact, but he's recalling what happened, and the Rabbanim all sitting and discussing this, and just the third paragraph there in source 8, beginning the hinei. He brings a nice little anecdote at the end, which for halavai we should be zocher to nowadays. He says, "V'hinei bitasef rashi am gedolei haTorah ladun b'noseh hazeh b'chinat halacha." While the Rabbanim, we were all sitting around the table discussing what would be the halachic position on this hostage situation. While we were having this halachic discussion, what would be the halachic position on doing whatever we can to release the hostages there in Mivtza Yonatan? Canal. Higia Rosh HaMemshala Mar Yitzchak Rabin Zal Eleinu. As we were having these discussions, Yitzchak Rabin arrived, and he gave us the joyous news that Tzahal had managed to eliminate the wicked machablim, but Ozrehem, but Uganda, and those who supported them in Uganda, that he managed to release all the hostages. Already on the way back to Israel. So halavai, we should be zocher to such a thing that, toch kadei dionim, that we hear good news, as happened to Rav Ovadia in 1976. So that's another discussion in terms of this. So I guess the hashkafat hilchatit, the halachic sort of perspective on the question of pidyon shvuyim, and at what price. Rav Ovadia certainly took a stance, and many disagreed with him on this stance. A couple of other points to add, though, I think, just in terms of the halachic discussion here, is that this is all very well and true. First, as I said, in 1976, but the reality we've shown is that when we look at Simchat Torah, some of those perpetrators we look at, and even the masterminds behind it, were people who were released in Iskat Shalit, in the Shalit deal. So we have to ask ourselves, whether Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who wrote this in 1976, was talking about a different reality, or Paskin this in 1976 was a different reality in Tafshin Pei Dalet. That's something we have to ask ourselves. And I said, we're just learning Torah here and looking at sort of the historic discussions on this issue. But whether we can really say nowadays, Safek or Vadai, that one is Vadai and one is Safek, because it would seem that what is Safek is pretty, as we said, the halachic category of Karov Levadai. That there's almost certainty that when you release somebody like this, that they're going to just go back to what they've done until this point.
Of
course.
You said if it was like time of Korban, then you were allowed to go to more. Is Korban only Beit HaMikdash, or like?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So this essentially takes me on to the next point I wanted to discuss. Remind me your name again? Yocheved. Hi. So just what Yocheved said is an excellent point. Yocheved, just to repeat it for those on the recording, Yocheved asked, we saw that answer in Tosfot, the final answer of Tosfot, the Shat HaChurban is different. Does that mean Mamash talking about the Tkufa, the era of the Khurban Bayit Sheni, or is that a mitziyut? Is that a reality essentially of Khurban, which we might say would apply today? So we'll get to that in one moment. Before I get there, another sort of halachic personality who was in favor of hostage deals, even if it meant Shifron Machablim, was Rav Shal Yisraeli, right? Shiv Mechas Harav, the Dayan in the Beit Din of Shalayim, also a Nasi of Eretz Chemda Institute. And Rav Shal Yisraeli claimed that certainly when it comes to Chayalim, that even if we look at those halachic sugyot about that one is not allowed to redeem for more than their worth, that's only a limitation on the community. But the individuals we saw could do whatever they want to release themselves. Said Rav Shal Yisraeli that when somebody signs up for the army, it's almost a given, it's built in that they are doing it, they're going to join the army on the premise that if God forbid anything should happen to them, that the Medina will do everything they can to bring them back. Said Rav Shal Yisraeli, it's almost like an insurance policy. It's like one takes out insurance, that if something happens to me, then the Medina or the army will pay essentially to get me out. And therefore, if it's like an insurance policy, it's your own money. The insurance are just paying on your behalf. You've got an insurance policy. Somebody can take an insurance policy out on a house. One can also take out an insurance policy on Chas v'Chalila being taken hostage. And therefore, said Rav Shal Yisraeli, it's implicit in somebody who signs up to Tzahal that certainly that the Medina will do everything they can to bring them back. And therefore, it's as if they're sort of cashing in on one's own insurance. And therefore, the halachic discussion doesn't apply. It'd be interesting to see what Rav Shal Yisraeli, and he doesn't say this inside, whether he would extend that to if maybe we didn't really believe that it's really a reality, that what if not only a chayal, but if an ezrach, if a citizen is taken into captivity, would one say that the Brit Damim that we have here in Medina Israel is that, that not only af chayal lo nishar me'achar, but af ezrach lo nishar me'achar. So it's a reality we never imagined we'd have to contend with. So that's an interesting, an additional factor here. But to come to your point, Yocheved, Rav Chaim David Halevi was Rav Rashi of Rishon LeZion and in Tel Aviv. He argued exactly your point. He was Madaik. He made the inference that you did in Tosfot. Meaning, until this point, we read B'shat Churban, that the final answer of Tosfot, that the Churban is different, was referring to the period of time, the era of the Churban Bayit Sheni. That is when this concern didn't apply because we're worried about the here and now. Rav Chaim David Halevi disagreed, and he said that that's not really what it's talking about. But when Tosfot had said there, I didn't bring it on the sheet, but when Tosfot, if you look at the top of the page, when said at the end of the line there, B'shat Churban Habayit, Lo Shach Lo Ligrabu, it's not referring to a period of time, but it's referring to a reality. Shat Churban Habayit is not referring to when the Romans have taken over Eretz Yisrael, but it's referring to a reality when you're with an enemy who is coming to destroy you. They're not looking to make a buck on by kidnapping a few people, or they're looking for something fun, but their intention, their sole intention is to destroy Medina Israel, and their sole intention is to destroy the Jewish people, the Jewish nation. That is what Shat Churban means. Says Rav Chaim David Halevi, if that's the case, then any enemy, any terrorist group who comes and takes people hostage, that is the same reality of Shat Churban. Because if we think about it, by us releasing or paying, it won't necessarily incentivize, says Rav Chaim David Halevi, a terrorist organization to do more, because they're going to do it anyway. Their whole mandate, their whole system in their charter is to destroy us. That is their goal. That's always their goal. And it's not a question of, this is a good idea. They don't suddenly wake up and think, post Gilad Shalit did. What a brilliant idea. Let's do this more. That's always what they're planning to do. They're always planning to attack us. That is Shat Churban. And therefore argued Rav Chaim David Halevi that any terrorist group who's out to destroy us, that is considered the same parameters of Shat Churban. And therefore there would be no limitations, because whatever we do, they're always going to try. Tamid ondim aleinu lechalotenu. And therefore, no restriction would apply. We're essentially out of time, so I just wanted to add just for one final minute, an important voice in this discussion from a shir from a while back is Rav Asher Weiss, the Milchat Asher. Rav Asher Weiss discussed all of this sugya as a halachic topic of interest to discuss, and he doesn't bring what I just said from Rav Chaim David Halevi, that the reality today is different, but he argues that the reality today is different for a different reason. If we look in source 9, says Rav Asher Weiss, When we look at this discussion, the only sources we have to return to are those of Chazal. They were speaking about entirely different reality. That then all those discussions that we saw there, they were just trying to take as much money as possible from the Jewish communities. But nowadays, one should never assume that one should never assume that if we don't give in to their demands, that they'll just wait and they'll what's the word? They'll compromise. No, like their wicked nature, they'll just kill and they'll murder those who they're not able to get anything out of. And therefore, Rav Asher Weiss says you can't compare. I mean, this was a nice shiur to give, but don't try and learn anything from the shiur to their Torah. It was wonderful, but don't try and extrapolate anything from the halachic sugya to the reality of today. And he adds further in the second paragraph, despite all this, it also seems when it comes to shat milchama, time of war, and when there's a malchut, there's a sovereign government, there's leadership, the halacha and the parameters are different. But the rules and parameters of saving a life at the time of war are different rules and regulations. Wartime is different to peacetime. And therefore, he says, also in our case, ultimately, it's up to the government, it's up to the malchut, it's up to the leadership to decide what is right for the welfare of the nation as a collective. And therefore, the leadership of the government, they were the ones who ultimately have to weigh out the factors here. And he quotes this idea of insurance policy. He concludes there the final paragraph. Soft davar, ultimately, don't compare discussions that we saw in the sources, which were all about just trying to get a ransom for money. You can't compare that to a case of a war in Israel. That it's up to the memshala to weigh out the correct factors as to what's right. Studying Rabbim, and there's many factors. That you can't compare one source to the other. So we daven that Hashem should give eitzah to the memshala v'yoat sehem. So we daven for Rasha Sareh v'yoat seha. This is what it means. That Hashem should give them the right eitzot to make the right decisions, and ultimately, if they Hashem Shavun Vau Sion Verina.
So ultimately, you're saying there is no answer. There is no like.
There's no. It would seem that there's no halachic. It's up to the Memshalas, and we daven they should have the right eitzah and sohot tohot bezrat Hashem. Thank you again, Rabbi Shandelov. Thank you, Mishpachat Lipschitz.
Thank you, Rabbi Brull, very much for this very timely shiur. And for those who are available at 10:15 or 10:20, 10:20 here at Yeshivat Tichonit is going to be the Shloshim memorial for Ari Hashem Yikom Damo, and we share Besorot Tovot.
One sentence, can you answer?